All is not well in India's neighbourhood on the economic front. Our southern neighbour Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic downturn since 1948. Lengthy blackouts, record inflation and acute food and fuel shortage for months have sparked increasing discontent among people, leading to nationwide protests against the Rajapaksa government. Many of the elements of the Sri Lankan crisis find similarities in Pakistan too, where inflation is galloping, the Pakistani rupee, like its Sri Lankan counterpart, is struggling, and both fiscal and current account deficits have ballooned beyond control. Likewise in North, the economy of Nepal also seems to be spiralling down. Prices are soaring and the foreign exchange reserves diving nose down. Amid efforts by the country to reduce imports, experts warn things in the economy could be on the verge of collapse. And eastwards, panic has also gripped Myanmar over the growing likelihood of a Sri Lanka-type economic collapse after the country's central bank called on all citizens this month to convert their foreign currency holdings and remittances received from abroad into the local currency within a day. Myanmar's foreign reserves are also believed to have dwindled sharply, and foreign debt has escalated over the last couple of years. So while there are a number of domestic factors as well as the pandemic causing economic distress in these countries, one thing running common between them is that they're all part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Through BRI, China has been investing heavily in building ports, roads, bridges, dams, power stations, rail networks, etc., overwhelming these countries with huge amounts of debts that are not sustainable. As a result of which, some countries have had to also give up their strategic assets. That's what has been termed as China's debt trap diplomacy. Hello and welcome to the Global Debate. I'm Teena. On the show today, we will discuss China's lending practices. How does it work? Is it burdening low and middle income countries with unsustainable debt? How does it impact the world? And is there a solution to this debt trap diplomacy? To discuss these aspects and more, I'm joined on the program by four eminent panelists to share their views with us. I'm pleased to welcome on this edition of the Global Debate, Ms. Alicia García-Herrero. She's Senior Fellow at the Brussels-based European think tank BRUEGEL. She's also the Chief Economist for Asia-Pacific at the French investment bank Natixis. Also joining us is Professor Pádraig Carmody. He's a lecturer in development geography at Trinity College, Dublin. Joining us is also Ms. Jhoomar Mehta, Associate Consultant, Policy and Communications, Policy and Development Advisory Group. And I'm also pleased to welcome on the program Mr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, joining us from Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to welcome all four guests on this edition of the Global Debate on Sansad TV. Mr. Abeyagoonasekera, allow me to begin the program today with you. So in the wake of the crisis which Sri Lanka is reeling under, the worst since 1948, how big is the China factor? Of course, we understand there are several domestic factors, of course, but how is China's lending practice also contributing to the crisis that the country is reeling under?
China is not the only factor, but China is a larger factor that affects the insolvency issue that we are having, because none of the Chinese projects has generated the expected revenue. Be it the Hambantota port, be it the Mattala airport, there's no flights coming in. So all of the business models are not has a serious question there. The Chinese, the debt trap, which has been sort of coined by Indian professor Brahmachalani in 2017. I see a pattern. I call it a strategic trap on top of the debt trap, because I see that there are three areas that China has significantly worked in Sri Lanka. One is on the political sphere of the Rajapaksas, the SLPP and the CCP, the political front funding. The next is the human rights, where China backs the Rajapaksa regime's human rights concerns at Geneva. and finally the military and the surveillance. So there are three dangerous factors that I see that Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka. It's a larger, there is a larger percentage, I would say, the Chinese debt that we cannot repay, but the Chinese are not agreeing for us with the Sri Lankan government on restructuring. So there is a serious issue, but Chinese are ready to give us more loans to settle their own loans. But what interest? So there is transparency issue in the Chinese loans. We borrowed for 6.8%. You know, the Hambantota report is a classic case discussed. So we are under serious distress.
Okay. Ms. Jhoomar, Mehta, coming in for your perspective. So he has explained to us that it's not just a debt trap. It goes beyond that. He calls it strategic trap. What is your perspective? Because similar situations are being witnessed in our western neighborhood, in Pakistan, also eastwards, in Myanmar, there is panic, and also in Nepal. And one common thread is that all of these countries are signatories to the BRI. All of them have taken huge loans from China. To what extent is China's debt policy to blame for what's actually happening, what's unraveling in our neighborhood? And how is it affecting India?
I think India is definitely not in a very favorable position, given our neighbors falling prey to the debt trap diplomacy, as we're terming it right now. I do believe that with the OBOR in place, with the One Belt, One Road initiative in place, and a lot of our neighboring countries agreeing to be a part of that project with China, the issue is that it is often a win-win situation for both the sides. China gets to expand its trade, and relatively, starving for infrastructure, they get access to that kind of infrastructure and that kind of financial backing to build that kind of infrastructure. So, I think we would build upon that conversation moving forward as well. The Chinese loans are more easy to access in terms of the grace periods and the kind of terms that they are offered at, as compared to a lot of maybe often the World Bank or IMF as well. For India, it is becoming problematic because a lot of time it has been seen, maybe sometimes in Africa as well, if we see that as a bloc, that China does try to safeguard its security and political position when it offers such loans to certain developing countries, wherein again, a lot of the clauses in these loans aren't made public. So the transparency is always a factor. But a lot of times we've seen in certain African nations that there are certain hardline issues in China, wherein the African countries which enjoy close relationships with China and have taken loans and are in debt, they're not allowed to say vote or say support issues such as the Taiwan issue. So if China is moving forward, is going to leverage that kind of role that they're playing in these countries, it becomes a problem, a major issue for India, who is often seen as a regional rival to China, that we would not enjoy support from our own neighboring countries at a lot of international platforms on critical issues, which again might not go in our favor going forward.
Professor Carmody, what is your view? This was about Asia that we were discussing, and the situation here has been pretty bad, especially in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and there are signs of economic distress in Nepal, also in Myanmar. Africa is one continent where there has been significant Chinese expansion over the last 2 decades. As on date, China is the largest creditor for a lot of African countries. Is similar situation also being witnessed in the African continent? Can we say that the debt trap diplomacy of China is also at play in this resource-rich continent of Africa?
So I think we have to distinguish between a couple of different things. One is the rising power of China globally, economically, politically, militarily. The other is whether it's trying to consciously construct a debt trap. And I'd argue that that's not the case, because it actually goes against Chinese interests. If they can't get their loans repaid, that has ramifications for their banks. It reduces economic growth in the recipient countries of those loans so they can absorb fewer Chinese exports. So I think what we, and Asanga mentioned it there, what we've seen is bad investment appraisal. And the Chinese realized themselves that this needed to change in about 2016-17, and they started tightening up their investment appraisal for overseas projects. And so loans have dramatically reduced in the last 5 or 6 years on foot of that. So we need to be careful to separate out these things. It doesn't mean that China doesn't have strategic interests in particular places like Sri Lanka, or in the African case, Djibouti, where most of that country's debt is owed to China. About 3/4 of the economy equivalent is owed in debt to China. And Djibouti is on a very strategic trade route. About a third of the world's trade transits off the coast of Djibouti. It's where China has its first overseas military base, for example. So there are exceptional cases like that where there are very pronounced strategic interests. But the idea that there is an overall debt trap diplomacy being pursued globally, I think, is mistaken. About 20% of Africa's total overseas debt is owed to China by official statistics, but about half of the books half of the loans are so-called off-book, so it may be about 30% or so. So it is very significant in Africa, and obviously with, as you mentioned, COVID, there's been a need for government to take out more debt to keep essential social services working and so on. So the issue has been compounded by COVID, but it's, as I say, it's not a deliberate attempt to entrap countries in debt, even if it may appear like that on the surface, I think.
Okay, but Ms. Alicia Herrero, what we are seeing on the ground is somewhere different. So maybe not overtly, but the hidden debt in terms of numbers is huge. And if we go by data given by aid data, it says about $384 billion of hidden debt. What is your perspective? Is China using its lending practices as a strategic tool with the long-term vision of securing economic, political access and influence in countries across continents?
I would start by answering the question this way. A debt trap can be a debt trap even if you don't intend it to be. But that's not so important to me, whether, to be frank, whether China strategically wanted to create a debt trap. What is important is that the debt trap is there. That's what matters here. So whether China inadvertently lent that huge amount on books or off balance sheet, which, as you rightly point out, is a much bigger figure, is somewhat, put it this way, in the first, imagine it was inadvertently. Well, it's then a big problem because what we're saying here is that China is able to lend a humongous amount of money even for China inadvertently. I mean, this means that what's going to happen, and there I want to fully agree with Professor from Trinity College, sorry, I can't repeat your name, because that lending is now decelerating because of China's own needs. So let's take the inadvertently hypothesis. Even so, now these countries, many of them, are seeing the wave of inflows from China coming back to China at the worst of all times, because this is when the Fed is tightening. So, you know, this is what we call a sudden stop in capital inflows. Yeah, I mean, they're all seeing this money leave because China has its own issues. So in a way, what I'm trying to say here is that for the host country, it's probably not so important whether it was, caused by China or just happened to be a debt trap for that country. What we know is that China will no longer lend as it used to. And for countries that were becoming addicted, whether it's their own fault or, a strategic decision by China, addicted to that debt, now they need to live without. And that's really where we are. On top of that, the cost of money is so huge in dollars because of the Fed that they have no alternative. It's not the time to find other alternatives. And this is why we're seeing Pakistan, Sri Lanka, everybody now. These are economies with large current account deficits. So there's the China story, but there's also the cyclical story. It's happening now because we had COVID and now we have the Fed. This is the combination of factors that, to me, explain the story.
Mr. Asanga, let me come back to you and try and understand what then is the solution. So deliberate or not, it is a debt trap, and you say it's beyond its strategic debt trap. What is the solution, in fact? There have been concerns by global bodies, from global institutions as well. But do you see a solution to this?
Well, I don't see Sri Lanka coming out of this strategic trap I mentioned anytime soon, because Sri Lanka does not have a government right now. The ministers have resigned. We have 2 cabinets appointed back to back. The dysfunctionality in the political sphere was because China's support for an autocratic regime. It supported all the amendments, from constitution amendments of the president, Rajapaksa, even mentioning that we need to follow the Chinese model. The Rajapaksas did say that. China was the only country that supported Rajapaksa's autocratic model. I mean, he was making a model with the military, 26 military appointments, just like Pakistan. Telecommunications, disaster management, foreign ministry, all of the ministries, we had military presence. It is going, so this is the danger that I see. It's a clear danger. I don't see anytime soon that we can stabilize this situation, because even the international partners are finding it difficult, like IMF, which we have reached for immediate $3 billion assistance, but restructuring China has not agreed. China does not agree. So they are ready to give more loans. And on what interest rates, we don't know. I think many of the things on the debt trap is misunderstood by, for example, even in the Chatham House paper, it clearly mentions some of the stuff like military, naval vessels can't enter Hambantota. That is completely incorrect, because I was the Director General of the National Security Think Tank. Military vessels can enter Hambantota port, and that has been captured even by the Pentagon report last year. So a lot of things, I think, has been misunderstood on the debt trap, only focusing on the volume. The Chinese volume is much lesser than other sovereign bonds. But Chinese borrowings are on a higher percentage and with a lot of conditionality.
Professor, how would you like to respond to this? So because, the lending practices are opaque. Now China is unwilling to restructure its loans with Sri Lanka, despite looking at the situation which is going from bad to worse. The people are suffering. And also the fact that, it is giving out loans to pay off its own loans. How does one explain that? Sure.
So I think the fact that China generally is unwilling to restructure debt or to forgive debt, it restructures more than it forgives, speaks to the generally commercial nature of these loans. So for China, it's about accessing new markets, getting exports of steel, cement, and other commodities like that, where there's massive overcapacity in China, finding new markets for those by building ports, by building roads and railways overseas. China poured more cement from 2011 to 2013 than was used in the United States in the whole of the 20th century, and they have a massive overcapacity issue in their domestic industries. So giving loans to countries to build infrastructure is a way of displacing that problem. So the focus is mostly commercial for China. And I think the debt trap discourse is a bit of a red herring. It doesn't mean that Chinese lending practices are unproblematic at all. They're highly problematic. And as Asanga was saying, many of the Belt and Road projects around the world have failed to live up to expectations. And some of them have become white elephants, which have saddled countries with unsustainable debt. But we need to be clear-eyed about the different vectors of power, the different ways in which China exercises influence. And I'd argue debt is only one of those. China has been the world's biggest economy, according to the IMF, when measured in Chinese currency, since 2013. So it has massive market power. It has political influence. And interestingly, I did a study a couple of years ago, which found that countries that trade more with China are more likely to vote with the United States in the United Nations General Assembly, except on human rights issues. And that's a strategy of balancing. So the idea that there is an overweening China, which is able to completely dominate countries in Africa or Asia and have them do its political bidding, actually isn't borne out by the data.
Ms. Jhoomar, Mehta, the fact is China has emerged as one of the largest creditors as on date. The debt problem is knocking on the door louder and louder. Is there, in fact, when we compare ourselves to China's development partnership, as another Asian giant, India too has been engaged in development partnership with several countries in Africa, in our neighborhood particularly. And not even one case of what we are discussing today when it comes to China of a debt trap. How different is India's development cooperation vis-a-vis Chinese?
The strategy that China has employed has been going on for quite some years. So the Africa or the Sri Lanka that we're looking at right now, it didn't happen overnight. It's a culmination of, close relationships and trust between these countries as well, which have been going on for quite a few years. And within Africa as well, China, when it entered Africa, they had at least I believe, that the common points were that they had a population they could not control initially. Both were the regions which were previously colonized, and they really wanted to ramp up their infrastructure projects. So they did find that commonality with which they entered the region, and they were able to gain the trust in that region. At the same time, I think the African countries as well have been, for the longest, been saying that we want beyond aid and charity and social services, which they often receive from the Western nations, and that we want to trade as well, and we want to come on board as equal partners, which China did give it to them actually. And I think India is also entering the domain on similar lines. While I in no way would I be in a place to compare the loans, because we aren't really sure of the transparency in terms of the Chinese loans being offered. But India is definitely entering the space, and I think in the case of Sri Lanka as well, in terms finding a solution, how do you get yourself out of such debt traps? I think in the last negotiation with Sri Lanka, India was able to convince Sri Lanka to let go of certain infrastructure projects with China, and they enter in those negotiations with India instead. I think going forward, India could also, again, it would require a lot of investments from our end, given we're a developing country ourselves.
Absolutely. And our pockets aren't as deep as the Chinese, so that is where the problem lies. Exactly. That is where we will need larger cooperation. Ms. Alicia, what can the world do? In fact, when I was going through the research, I came across this framework that the G20 came up with, but it's not been as effective as it was supposed to be in helping debt of countries in danger of defaulting. What can global bodies, the developed countries particularly, do to check China's rise in this particular field, so that vulnerable countries, they do not have to face the kind of situation that Sri Lanka is reeling under?
Well, it's a great question. I think the G20 should have done more. They took a positive decision, but certainly not sufficient decision in March 2020, if I recall correctly, which was the setup of the DSSI, which is basically offering countries the ability not to pay their debt and their interest and this was renewed until December 2020, so the end of the Italian presidency of the G20. But we know quite well that although there were many discussions as to how to improve on that delay in payments to something closer to a restructuring for the countries that knew for a fact that their debt was unsustainable, didn't happen, also because China supposedly, and that's what we hear, opposed to that initiative. And I think I have to say, we also need to understand that in China's mindset, restructuring is something that doesn't happen even in China, onshore, among banks and debtors. The whole idea is that you always keep the face value, and you may delay payments, you may reduce interest payments, whatever, but you keep the face value. So we also need to understand that it's somehow of a, if I may say, Western concept that China doesn't want to accept. So there is also more than just the idea that China doesn't want to see a reduction in net present value. Is also about the fact that the contracts need to be paid in face value. So we need to find, and I actually made a proposal for the Italian G20, alternative solutions. We need to think out of the box. The proposal I made was to create a debt restructuring fund, global debt restructuring fund. So basically move away the restructuring from the existing institutions, from the IMF, and try to come up with swaps, that this was swaps of all debt for new debt with better conditions, including China, and trying to come up with, new loans for digitalization, green. I mean, trying to come up with a different setup, because
Absolutely.
I think we're stuck in the old setup where China doesn't really feel it belongs.
Absolutely. So in the wake of this rising new threat, which is being exposed now in more and more countries, the Chinese debt trap diplomacy is for all of us to now see. It's evident in South Asia, in Africa, in some countries as well. Deliberate or not, the fact is vulnerable countries are suffering, and the world needs to come together to form a new structure, as Ms. Alicia has suggested, and sooner the better to check this kind of neo-colonialism which is on the rise by China. So that having been said, I'll have to wrap up the program on that very note. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts, your perspectives with us and our viewers on this very, very pertinent topic. It was a pleasure having you on the program today. So that's it from us on this edition of The Global Debate. Thank you to all my viewers as well for your time. See you again next week. Thanks very much once again.